The widow. All she does is prowl after other women's husbands. The venomous whisper fell across Redstone's midday market, sharp enough to set fire to every scornful eye and mocking laugh that followed. From the saloon porch, a crude whistle cut through the heat, followed by the coarse laughter of idlers, turning Naomi Carter into a cheap amusement under the merciless sun. She clutched her wicker basket tight, bit her lip until it bled, and quickened her steps past the jealous stares of wives and the jeering voices that trailed her like whips. The sky darkened without warning, clouds pressing low and heavy. Rain broke loose in a sudden torrent, driving townsfolk to scatter for cover beneath awnings. Yet Naomi stood unmoving in the muddy street, letting the downpour wash over her. Her black hair clung wet against her face. Her trembling features lifted to the heavens as if begging the storm to cleanse away her shame. And from the porch of the coffee house, Ethan Ward's grip tightened around the cold cup in his hand. In that instant, he saw the truth. This was no longer a despised widow to be ridiculed, but a soul crying out for deliverance. A soul that pierced his chest with an ache so deep, it left him with only one choice: to step forward and shield her from the cruelty of the entire town. The midday market of Redstone always boiled like a pot left too long on the fire. Chickens squawked, voices bargained sharp and loud, wagon wheels grated against the packed red dirt. The crowd jostled and pressed, but in all that noise and bustle, Naomi Carter always seemed to stand apart. Not because she wished it so, but because no one could help but look. She moved with her basket clutched close, a worn shawl draped loosely about her shoulders. Her face, though touched by grief's long shadow, still carried a quiet gentleness. Smooth skin caught the harsh sunlight, and her dark, deep eyes, shadowed with sorrow, carried a strange, magnetic pull. Her beauty was unspoken, unadorned, yet in a town as rough as this one, it made her a target. To some women, it was a thorn they couldn't ignore. A knot of women clustered by the fabric stall, fingers trailing over bolts of cloth while their whispers darted like knives. Look at her, showing herself off in that thin shawl. Every man passing by gives her a glance. No wonder the wives can't stand her. Couldn't keep her own husband alive, now she prowls after others. Naomi bit her lip, her hand tightening around the basket's handle as she quickened her step. Yet the whispers clung to her like a shadow she could never shake. Across the street, on the saloon porch, a row of idle men sat with boots propped, cheap beer in hand. When Naomi passed, one of them let out a long, shrill whistle, his voice rough as gravel, dragging laughter from the others. Another leaned forward, calling out with a jeer, "Bet when the rain hits, that dress of yours will cling real fine, widow." The women nearby stiffened, cheeks flaring red. Their eyes snapped toward Naomi, sharp with blame, as if she had invited such filth upon herself. One wife yanked her husband's sleeve as his gaze lingered too long. "You look one more time and you'll be sleeping in the barn," she hissed. Then she turned her fury on Naomi, her words like a knife's edge. "Snake." Naomi kept her eyes to the ground, her pace quick but heavy. Still, the barbs echoed around her ears, impossible to escape. Her beauty, once an innocent thing, had become her crime in Redstone. To women, she was a threat. To men, a plaything. To herself, she was little more than a shadow pushed to the margins, without a place to belong. Then the sky darkened. The air grew thick, pressing low, until the heavens split open and rain came down in sheets. Townsfolk scrambled, shouting, clutching children and pulling carts, rushing beneath porches and awnings. Cries tangled with the splashing of hooves and wheels. the chaos of bodies seeking shelter. Only Naomi did not move. She stood in the open street as the storm beat down, soaking her hair, plastering it dark against her face. Water streamed along her cheeks, mingling with the salt of her tears until neither could be told apart. Her small shoulders quivered, yet her feet kept moving, each step swallowed by the mud. In the rain, there was no need to hide. She could cry silently, freely, letting the dirt and shame wash from her dress's hem. From the coffeehouse porch, Ethan Ward stood still. The sun-browned man held a cup of cold coffee, eyes fixed on her. He had seen it all, the whispers like barbs, the whistles sharp as whips, the jealous wives' glares, and at last, her face lifted skyward, wet with rain and sorrow. Never had he looked at Naomi so closely. But now, in the storm, her beauty was no longer something to envy or despise. It was the fragile grace of a soul pressed down, yet still raising its face to heaven as if to be cleansed. That frail, solitary figure in the rain pierced something inside him, striking like a wound he carried himself. And in that ache, Ethan knew he could no longer stand idle. The town of Redstone lay sunken in the midst of a barren highland, ringed by low red ridges that loomed like dry walls around it. At the far end of Main Street stood Henderson's General Store, the one place that never failed to open its doors each morning. And it was here that Naomi Carter spent her days. A widow barely past 30, her eyes carried dark circles of weariness, her back slightly bent from long hours of bending, sweeping, and stooping. In town, folks spoke of her as if she were a shadow, not because she drew attention, but because her quiet presence was all too easy to ignore. When the morning light spilled through the store's windows, Naomi could be found sweeping dust from the wooden floor, stacking sacks of sugar and flour neat along the shelves. Customers came and went, men in worn leather coats, housewives with sharp tongues, tossing coins onto the counter with a careless clatter. The coins rolled, ringing cold against the wood. Few ever raised their heads to look at her. Fewer still offered even the smallest smile. Some would even flick the money at her like a beggar's do, muttering to each other on their way out, loud enough for her to hear. That widow, like a ghost haunting this place. Naomi would stoop, gather each coin with steady hands, fighting back the tremor in her fingers, and tuck them carefully into the till. Her face seldom showed more than quiet endurance. It was not that she felt nothing, but that years of pressing sorrow had left her with no weapon but silence. When the day's business ended, she stepped out from the store, wrapping her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, and turned down the road toward the outskirts. The path to her small cabin wound through sparse, dry grass, the ridges casting dark shapes as twilight crept over the land. Each footfall on the hard earth echoed back at her, like her own solitude speaking. The cabin itself was a weather-beaten thing, a single room standing lonely against the open ground, as though even the town had chosen to set her apart. Inside, the stove lay cold, ashes gray among half-burnt logs. Naomi set her bundle on the table and sank onto a creaking wooden chair. Her gaze drifted to the corner where a man's coat still hung on a nail, long bereft of the warmth of the body that once filled it. In the stillness, memory rose to meet her. On the day of the funeral, the whole of Redstone had turned out, yet none stood close. Naomi wore a plain black dress, a veil shadowing half her face. The eyes upon her held no sympathy, only avoidance, as though her husband's death and her widowhood were burdens no one wished to share. The preacher rattled through the prayer, his voice brisk, eager to be done. The coffin sank into the earth, the thud of soil on wood resounding heavy and final. Naomi had stood motionless, her fingers interlaced so tightly her nails bit deep into her skin. Not one hand reached to hold hers. Not one word of condolence was spoken beside her. Only whispers, only heads shaking, and then the slow dispersal of a crowd relieved to have fulfilled an unpleasant duty. That image clung to Naomi, replaying itself each nightfall. She remembered her husband's face, the faint laughter that once warmed their fire-lit evenings, the fragile comfort of two voices filling the silence. And then, darkness. Everything extinguished, leaving her only with an empty cabin, a forgotten name, and a loneliness thick with redstone dust. She drew a breath, heavy and resigned, and reached for the stove, stacking a few dry sticks. The fire sputtered to life, its crackle casting light over her hollow cheeks. Naomi sat long before it, eyes fixed on the flickering embers, shrinking, then flaring, never quite gone, just like her heart, seeming spent, yet stubbornly sparking back to life, lit by memories that refused to be buried. Ever since the day he had watched Naomi weep silently beneath the rain, the image had haunted Ethan. At night, when the storm's echo still murmured in his memory, he saw again her trembling shoulders, her face blurred with tears and rain. Something within her had struck a chord in him, a part of himself he thought long since numbed. It was the longing to witness someone truly alive, truly hurting, truly vulnerable without disguise. From then on, Ethan found excuses to step into Henderson's store more often than any rancher living alone should have needed. He bought trifles, a coil of twine, a pouch of salt, a packet of nails, sometimes even just a rag for the table. Old Henderson, half blind and half asleep behind the counter, barely noticed. But Naomi always did. She was there behind the counter, lifting her head whenever the doorbell chimed. Each time, Ethan contrived some reason to draw her voice. He asked questions that needed no answer, fumbled over counting coins, even let small items fall so she would step out from behind the counter to pick them up. Other customers chuckled at his clumsy act, but Ethan paid them no mind. All he wanted was to hear her speak, if only a word or two. And each time she did, a strange warmth stirred in him. Some mornings he lingered by the shelves, pretending to debate over rope while noticing Naomi hefting a flour sack nearly larger than her own frame. He moved to help, but she instantly drew back, her brow creasing as though warding off some hidden insult. "I can manage," she said evenly, turning aside. Ethan only nodded, pressing nothing further. Yet moments later he quietly lifted the sack onto the high shelf she could not reach. Naomi froze for a breath, but offered no protest. Her glance brushed him, unreadable, before she turned away and went on with her work. On another day, Ethan arrived before dawn with a small bundle of dry wood. He left it by the store's door, claiming to himself it was simply on his way from the ranch. But truth be told, he knew Henderson's stove usually lay cold, and Naomi was always the one to kindle the morning fire. When she stepped outside and found the wood, her eyes brightened for the briefest instant. Yet she asked no questions, gave no thanks. She only gathered the sticks quietly, as if they had fallen from the sky itself. Once Ethan saw a gang of boys pitching stones at the store window, while Naomi stood nearby. He stepped forward, his stern gaze alone enough to scatter them in panic. Naomi witnessed it, but all she gave him was a small nod in place of thanks, her eyes as guarded as ever. She had lived too long with kindness that was only pretense, with men whose aid came laced with hungry eyes. Ethan knew she counted him among them, no different from the loafers whistling crude tunes on the street. She treated him as she did all others, perhaps even colder, wary of yet another man chasing after her beauty. Sometimes her brief frown told him she believed he was merely angling for her attention, like the rest. Ethan saw it. And strangely, he did not despair. He accepted the misunderstanding, if only to be present in her eyes a little longer, even if those eyes held nothing but caution, because he trusted that one day she would learn the truth, that he was not another cheap whistle in the dust, but a silence that knew how to see her and how to listen. Summer dusk pressed down heavy on Redstone, the sky swollen with dark clouds. Wind swept through the valley in sharp gusts, lifting red dust into hazy swirls that cloaked the town in a tense, breathless hush. Folks hurried to shutter shop fronts, drag wagons beneath cover, herd cattle into pens. Everyone knew a storm was coming. Out at the edge of town, Naomi sat motionless in her small cabin. The single room lay dim, only a thin seam of light slipping through the doorframe. The stove was cold, its ashes gray, no warmth left to chase away the gathering gloom. From the distance, thunder boomed, shaking the ground beneath her feet. Naomi rose and laid her hand on the latch. In that instant, she felt it plain. If she stayed still another minute, she would suffocate. The door flung wide. The wind rushed in, carrying the damp scent of rain. Heavy drops began to pound the roof, thick and unrelenting. Naomi stepped into the yard, shoulders squared as water streamed over her shawl. She tugged off her soaked shoes, peeled away her stockings, and left them on the step. Bare feet pressed into the cool mud, the sensation surging up her spine, startling, yet strangely freeing. She turned in a slow circle. The weight of her wet dress dragged against the earth, splashing puddles with each spin. She turned again, faster, her dark hair loosed, clinging wet against her cheeks. Rain lashed across her face, but through it broke a hoarse laugh, then sobs mingled with the storm. Years of silence, months of bowed endurance, all came unraveled in that clumsy dance beneath the downpour. From the porch of a ranch house on the hillside, Ethan Ward stood watching, a cold cup of coffee gripped tight in his hand. Lightning split the sky, and for an instant he saw her clearly. The widow shunned by the town, letting the rain consume her, turning in the storm as if the world belonged to her alone. He narrowed his eyes, scarcely trusting his vision. But it was Naomi. Her black hair hung heavy, her bare feet pressed into mud, her face lifted heavenward with something that looked like both anguish and release. A widow, he thought, and yet, how could anyone be this beautiful? It was not the polished beauty of the younger women in Redstone. This was a beauty carved from hardship, born of grief, sharpened by a will that refused to die. It was the rare, fierce beauty of a soul breaking its chains to live, if only for a single storm. Naomi spread her arms, eyes closed, catching the rain as if it were mercy poured from the sky. Ethan's chest tightened. The cup in his hand had long gone cold, but he could not set it down. He stood transfixed beneath his porch, fearing that if he blinked, the vision would vanish. The storm broke harder, thunder rolling like cannon fire. Still Naomi turned, laughter and sobs entwined, until at last she staggered breathless, her shoulders heaved, her body shivering. Quietly, she stooped, gathered her shoes, and disappeared back into the cabin. The soon wooden door swung shut, darkness swallowing her figure whole. Ethan remained staring. His heart pounded as if he had witnessed a miracle. A vow whispered itself inside him. I will never forget this. That night, after the storm passed, Ethan could not find rest. He lay on his wooden bed, eyes wide in the dark. Every effort to banish the memory failed. Again and again he saw her, Naomi dancing barefoot in the mud, her face turned to the sky, her defiance and her sorrow mingling in the rain. Tossing, turning, breath heavy beneath the quilt, Ethan felt the weight of years of solitude pressing against this single new image. He had lived too long with silence, too long with only the mountains and the rustle of pine for company. Yet now, in one night, the widow's stormlit dance had etched itself into his soul, and Ethan Ward knew, with a certainty that both unsettled and steadied him, that his life would never again be the same. The morning after the storm, Redstone seemed washed clean under a sky of startling blue. Sunlight glinted off rooftops and shimmered across the puddles left in the rutted streets. Yet the town itself was far from renewed. Whispers had begun to stir, weaving through every stall and doorway like smoke too thin to catch. No one knew who spoke first, but by sunrise the tale had spread. The widow Naomi Carter had gone out into the storm, not to seek shelter or pray for safety, but to dance, laughing and weeping, turning round and round in the deluge like a woman possessed. She spun, laughed and cried beneath the thunder, someone claimed, twirling a finger in mockery before bursting into crude laughter. In a single night, the rumor of Naomi's madness had caught fire, burning through town like dry grass set alight. The market filled again as it always did, stalls piled with vegetables still damp with mud, laundry strung between posts before the fabric shop, the scent of fresh bread rising from the baker's oven. Yet amid the bustle, eyes slid away from goods and followed a lone figure moving down the row. Naomi came as she always did, wicker basket held close, heading straight for the produce stalls. She walked with practiced composure, but her steps were heavier. She could feel it, the way voices fell quiet when she passed, then buzzed to life behind her, a swarm of stings at her back. I saw it myself. She was dancing like a lunatic. She just wanted the men to notice. That's what she does best. Naomi lowered her head and laid a few coins on the stall. The seller, an older woman known for her sharp tongue, smirked as though savoring a secret. Then, with feigned clumsiness, she tipped a basket of vegetables. Cabbages and carrots spilled with a thud against Naomi's skirt, tumbling into the wet dirt. "Oh dear, my hand slipped," the woman said, her smile edged with venom. Naomi froze, her face flushing hot. Tears welled but did not fall. She bent slowly, gathering each vegetable from the mud, brushing them off, and placing them carefully into her basket. No protest, no defense, only silence. Nearby women snickered, one of them calling out, "Pick them up, widow. Maybe tomorrow you'll get to dance with carrots instead." Their laughter rang shrill, souring the air. Across the street, Ethan Ward had just tied his horse outside the coffee house. He caught every word, every laugh. His gaze fixed on Naomi, crouched in the muck, her hands trembling as she lifted each piece of produce. Heat surged through him, his fist clenching until the knuckles blanched, veins rising beneath the skin, jaw set tight as stone. Every instinct screamed at him to stride over, silence the cruelty, lift Naomi to her feet. But he held himself still. He knew if he stepped in now, it would only deepen her shame, feed the gossip further. And yet, watching her bow her head, gathering vegetables with quiet resolve, he felt something stronger than pity. He saw strength, a hidden dignity in her silence. Ethan forced his grip to ease, though the fire inside him did not die. He alone carried the memory of the night before, Naomi turning in the storm, her sorrow breaking into wild, defiant freedom. That was the truth. What the crowd called madness was in fact the fierce pulse of life itself. But envy and smallness could not bear such a sight. All they saw was a distorted shadow, their jealousy twisted into scorn, their bitterness sharpened into cruelty. Naomi rose at last, her basket heavy with soil-stained produce. Her skirt clung with mud, her back damp with sweat, but her posture held straight as she walked swiftly from the market. That morning, Redstone hummed with poisonous chatter and cruel amusement. Yet within the silence between two people, one woman leaving with her head unbowed, one man standing beneath a porch with his fist still marked from its clench, an invisible thread had been tied. And though no one else could see it, it held with a strength deeper than rumor. That night, the wind came down from the mountains carrying an uncommon chill. Overhead, a thin crescent moon hung pale and distant, casting silver across the gaunt treetops and pooling faint light over the roof of the small cabin where Naomi lived alone. The oil lamp on her table had burned down to its last wick, leaving only a feeble glow that deepened the emptiness of the room. Naomi sat by the window, listening to the dense silence pressing against the walls. She was used to quiet, but this silence felt different, as if something lurked just beyond it. Suddenly, a knock struck the door. 3 blows, hard and hurried. Naomi flinched, dropping the scrap of cloth she had been mending. Few ever came at such an hour. She rose slowly, every nerve taut, straining to hear. Outside, only the wind moaned. No name called. No voice announced itself. She cracked the door. Before she could speak, a heavy body shoved through, forcing the door wide. A man stumbled in, reeking of whiskey. His face was flushed, beard wild, eyes clouded with drunken heat. Naomi knew him, one of the loafers who haunted the saloon at the far end of town. "There you are," he slurred, a crooked grin spreading across his mouth. "Widow, all alone in the dark. You need a man, don't you?" Naomi stepped back, heart hammering. "Get out of my house," she whispered, her voice trembling yet firm. He laughed, a coarse, booming sound that filled the small cabin and made her skin crawl. "The whole town knows. You ain't got dignity left. They say you've gone mad, spinning in the rain, lonely, starving for company. So I came to remind you what a man feels like." He lunged, a calloused hand closing around her arm. Naomi jerked back, but his weight bore down like iron clamps. In a heartbeat, she was thrown against the wooden floor, her back slamming with a sharp jolt. His breath was heavy, his boots scraping, his shadow looming. Fear locked her body, her throat closing around the scream that rose. Shame surged up, blinding her with tears. She shoved at his chest, but the more she fought, the more hopeless it seemed. Then, the door burst open again. A figure filled the frame, shoulders squared against the moonlight. Ethan Ward strode in, his gray-blue eyes lit with fire. Without a word, he seized the drunkard by the collar and wrenched him off Naomi. The man snarled, but Ethan's fist cracked against his jaw with a sound that echoed in the cabin. He staggered, crashed against the table, yet drunken rage drove him up again. He lunged like a wounded beast. Ethan swung once more, then drove him down, pinning him hard against the floor. "Out!" Ethan's voice thundered, low and edged with steel. "Come near her again, and I'll see you don't walk away." The drunkard writhed, cursing, but Ethan's strength was immovable. Within seconds, the man's fight faltered. Breathing ragged, he crawled free and stumbled out into the night. His form reeled into the song, darkness, leaving behind only the stench of liquor and the tense hush of the cabin. Naomi sat slumped against the wall, chest heaving, hands trembling as they clutched her bodice. Her dress was torn askew, her face pale, eyes brimming. Ethan turned, his gaze meeting hers, and for a heartbeat he stopped cold. Then he lowered himself, kneeling a careful distance away so as not to startle her. "Are you hurt?" His voice was rough, tight with all he restrained. Naomi did not answer at once. Her breath shook, but the steadiness of his presence, solid, unyielding, began to still the panic in her. She nodded faintly, tears spilling down her cheeks. Ethan saw her hands quiver and slowly drew a worn handkerchief from his pocket, placing it gently beside her. He did not touch her, did not intrude, only left the cloth within her reach, a quiet gesture that said, "You may keep your distance, but I am here." Naomi lifted it, pressing it to her eyes. After a long moment, she managed to speak, her voice thin as thread. "Thank you. If you hadn't come—" Ethan cut her off, his tone firm. "I came." The silence that followed was deep, broken only by the wind keening through the shutters. Moonlight spilled across the floor, falling over two figures, one seated, one kneeling, both scarred by their own wounds, yet bound together in this fragile, wordless moment. At last Ethan rose. He checked the door, sliding the bolt tight, his gaze scanning the night to be certain the man was gone. Then he looked back at Naomi, giving only a brief nod, a vow unspoken. "I won't let this happen again." Naomi sat clutching the handkerchief, her heart beating with a strange new thrum. Shame and fear, yes, but also something warmer, elusive. Her bare feet were still cold against the wooden floor. Yet deep within her chest, a different fire had begun to stir. The next morning, Redstone awoke to a different kind of storm. At first light, Main Street buzzed with feverish talk that seeped beneath awnings and stalls like smoke curling into every corner. By sunrise, the tale had already spread. The drunkard had been seen staggering home, face swollen, clothes torn. It did not take long for the story to twist itself into something darker, that he had been tempted inside the widow Naomi Carter's cabin, that she had invited him in and brought disgrace upon herself. No one asked what truly happened. Truth mattered little. What people wanted was a tale sharp enough to cut her down, a story to confirm what they already despised. And it was the drunkard's wife who fanned the flames. A coarse woman, her voice had often silenced the market square. Now she bellowed in the middle of the street. "That woman lured my husband! A widow's whore playing at holiness with a belly full of snakes!" The accusation sliced like a blade, and the crowd surged around it. Many women, long harboring envy or suspicion, seized the chance to spill their venom. When Naomi appeared in the marketplace, basket in hand as always, every eye turned. The air tightened. She had taken only a few steps when a knot of women moved to block her. At their head, the drunkard's wife, face blazing red, eyes sparking with fury. Fox, she spat, her voice cracking but loud. Isn't this town enough for you? Must you steal even the husbands of others? Naomi faltered, her face drained of color. Before she could speak, a handful of mud splattered across her skirt, staining the fabric. A cry went up, shrill as crows taking flight. Shameless widow! Think you can tempt every man in town? We know what you are. Get out of Redstone! A hand seized her shawl, yanking it from her shoulders. The cloth tore with a sharp rip, laughter following like a scourge. Another woman shoved a basket of turnips against her chest. Naomi staggered back, nearly falling. She froze. The wicker basket slipped from her hands, vegetables spilling across the mud. Tears welled, streaking down her face. She did not cry out, did not defend herself. She only stood trembling in the circle that hemmed her in. To them, she was no longer flesh and blood, only a target, something to spit upon, to trample so they might feel themselves more righteous. A stone rolled to her feet, kicked there by someone in the crowd. No one bent to pick it up. Instead, the jeers rose higher, clawing at her like talons. On the edges, a few men lingered, watching with a mixture of curiosity and cruel delight. Many had once followed her with hungry eyes, whistling as she walked past. Now they stayed silent, letting the women break her down. That silence, cold and complicit, cut sharper than the words. Naomi's vision blurred with tears. Shapes around her dissolved, leaving only the roar of voices battering her ears. Each word landed like a lash, stripping her, bare, making her feel as though she were splintering apart. Her hands hung limp at her sides, her whole body quaking. In that moment, a thought came unbidden. Perhaps she should leave. Leave Redstone. Leave the cabin. Leave behind all that tethered her. For here, her very existence seemed to serve no purpose but to invite scorn. Another clump of mud struck, sliding through her hair, down her cheek. Naomi sobbed aloud then, her cry breaking through the din. But the sound only fed their frenzy, convincing them she was weaker, filthier, easier to crush. In their eyes, Naomi was no longer a woman to pity, but the embodiment of every threat they feared, the danger of beauty, of a glance their husbands once let stray. And so they tore her down together, stamping on that symbol until it no longer glimmered. Naomi stood amid them, drenched in mud and tears, her shawl ripped to shreds at her feet, her basket overturned. She longed for someone, anyone, to stop it, to reach for her hand. But as she trembled in the center of their circle, despair swallowed what little hope remained. The uproar filled Redstone's main street, louder than the thunder of hooves passing by. Naomi's dress sagged with mud. Her torn shawl lay at her feet, and her face glistened with tears. The more the crowd saw her weakness, the fiercer they became. Another handful of muck sailed through the air, but this time it never touched her. A strong arm reached out, taking the blow squarely across a broad back. The mud splattered and spread in a dull gray stain, and for a heartbeat, the mob fell silent. A tall man had stepped into the circle. Ethan Ward. He stood solid, shoulders broad enough to block every jeering eye, one hand drawing Naomi against his chest. She trembled in the unexpected shelter of his arms, too stunned to resist. Ethan lifted his head, gray-blue eyes flashing cold. His voice rang out, deep and steady, echoing like thunder rolling down from the mountains. Enough! The crowd wavered. A woman opened her mouth to curse, but Ethan's gaze struck her dumb. He went on, his words hard as iron. You've said more than enough. If any of you think yourselves pure, then cast the first stone. If not, be gone." Murmurs rippled, but none dared move closer. Men who lingered at the edges dropped their eyes, avoiding his. At last the drunkard's wife shoved forward, dragging her husband, his face still bruised, by the arm. She spat curses, but her voice had lost its edge. One by one the women pulled back, their anger thinning into uneasy silence. Soon the marketplace lay scattered with trampled produce and broken baskets, the mob dissolving into side streets. No apology was offered, no word of shame. They simply left Naomi where she stood, trembling in Ethan's hold, her face buried against his coat, tears soaking the fabric. Ethan held her close, saying nothing, letting her weep. The sobs came unchecked now, wrung from years of silence and scorn, from the cruelty he had just witnessed. Her grief shuddered through him, shaking his own chest with each gasp. He tightened his embrace, one broad hand steady at her back. At last he spoke, 3 words low but fierce, carrying through the heavy stillness. "I am here." Naomi's sobs broke harder at that. Yet within the storm of tears, she felt something she had not known in years. She was no longer utterly alone. His shoulders, his arms, that wall of strength, against an entire town turned hostile, were the only shield she had, and for once it was enough. Time stretched. Slowly, her sobbing eased, leaving her weary and hollow. She lifted her face, eyes swollen red, cheeks streaked with rain and tears. But in her gaze flickered something new, astonishment mingled with gratitude. Ethan looked down at her without a word, brushing mud gently from her hair. The street was nearly empty now, only a few stragglers glancing back before turning away. At their feet lay Naomi's overturned basket, vegetables scattered and dirt-stained. Ethan stooped, gathered it, and placed it carefully in her hands. Such a small gesture, yet it struck her like the return of something lost, the dignity the crowd had tried to strip from her. "Come," he said, his voice low and warm. "That's enough for one morning." Naomi could only nod. Side by side they left the square, the hush of whispers trailing behind. The sun had climbed high, casting their shadows long across the dirt road. She walked small and weary, while he strode half a step ahead, a silent shield between her and the world. Naomi's heart beat fast, uneven. She had never felt so fragile, yet never so strangely steadied. Shame clung to her like mud on her hem, but beneath it lingered a fragile peace, the memory of his arm around her, the words that still echoed. "I am here." From the moment Ethan raised his back against the mud, Naomi was no longer wholly a widow set apart. In that instant, the bond between them drew taut, invisible but unbreakable. Not pity, not duty, something born from seeing one another in pain and choosing, against all odds, to stand there together. That morning, the market square of Redstone had not yet shaken off the echoes of the chaos that had shaken it the day before. Folks whispered from stall to stall, trading words about Ethan Ward stepping forward to shield Naomi Carter against the fury of the crowd. Stories spread quick and twisted, each version sharper than the last. Some claimed Ethan meant to marry the widow, others scoffed that his chivalry was nothing but a fleeting whim. But all of them waited to see how Naomi would endure after the storm of shame. Into that charged silence strode a figure everyone knew too well, Harland Pike, master of the Redstone Bank. His presence made tongues wag instantly. Pike was a man swollen with indulgence, flesh sagging from a red, ruddy face, 3 chins wobbling with every step, his waistcoat straining against a glutted belly. Yet none dared laugh. Power clung to him heavier than his girth. Every man and woman in town owed him something, for Pike's bank sat at the heart of Main Street, and his loans were shackles few could slip. He did not just lend, he tightened the rope around Redstone's neck. That morning he cut down the street with a silver-headed cane, his belly quivering beneath straining buttons. Townsfolk shrank aside, parting to clear his way. He stopped at the very threshold of Henderson's store, just as Naomi stepped out, basket in hand. She froze. In an instant, she felt every eye swing toward her, the crowd holding its breath for a new spectacle. Harland planted his cane, lips curling into a smile that chilled the bone. His voice rang out, carrying for all to hear. "Miss Carter, I've a fine proposal for you. Everyone knows you owe the bank a fair sum, but should you consent to marry me, all of that debt would vanish." The words thundered through the square, and for a moment all of Redstone stood mute. Naomi felt her blood turn cold. Her eyes flew wide, her fingers slackened, and the basket slipped from her grasp. Vegetables spilled across the ground. Her knees buckled, forcing her down into the dirt, her palms catching against the wet earth to keep from collapsing fully. The square erupted in whispers. Some stifled laughs behind their hands. Others muttered with relish, "See? No one would take her but for her debts." A knot of wives exchanged smirks, their faces bright with vindication, as if justice itself had been done. Naomi heard every word. Each whisper pierced like needles, her face burning crimson with humiliation. Tears welled, spilling before she could hold them back. She looked up and found herself encircled by stares, those same eyes that had flung mud at her days before, now glittering with cruel delight at her ruin. And still Harland Pike stood over her, smug and certain he had driven her to the wall. He lifted his gaze, as though demanding the town remember this moment, to witness how his power could bow even the proud. Naomi tried to rise, but her legs trembled too violently. Through the blur of tears the marketplace swam, the air so thick it strangled. A deeper shame than mud and stones pressed upon her chest. "If only my husband still lived," she thought bitterly. "Would they dare humiliate me so? Or is widowhood nothing but open ground for every boot to trample?" She bent forward, hiding her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Her heart pounded, aching to burst from the weight of disgrace. Around her the voices kept rising. A man clicked his tongue, feigning pity. "Pretty enough, but in the end, just another bargain to be struck." A woman hissed, "A widow has no right to choose. She ought to know her place." The words crashed upon her like hammer blows. Naomi longed to vanish into the earth. Redstone had become a cage of iron, and she was the bird trapped inside, wings clipped and mocked before the crowd. And in the center of that ring stood Harland Pike, the banker, the glutton, the tyrant, brandishing her debt like chains, expecting her to kneel. Naomi sagged, clutching the rim of her wicker basket, her breath breaking in shallow gasps. Tears pattered down, darkening the red dust at her knees. The square fell into hush, the whole town waiting, their collective gaze heavy upon her. Would she bow her head? Would she break? For a moment, Naomi could only tremble, caught between despair and defiance. her silence echoing louder than all the voices that had sought to bury her. Once more the clouds gathered, heavy and dark, warning Redstone of another storm. The main street sagged with dampness, wind whistling through rattling awnings, the old dust giving off its sour scent as the first drops struck the earth. Folks crowded beneath Henderson's porch, still buzzing from the humiliation Naomi had just suffered at the hands of Harland Pike, the bloated banker. Naomi still knelt in the mud, clutching the fallen basket, her shoulders shaking with shame. Tears streamed freely, mingling with the fresh rain that streaked her face. Pike loomed above, his triple chin quivering with a grotesque grin of triumph. "Miss Carter," he boomed, pitching his words for every ear in town, "all you need do is nod, and your debts will vanish. For a woman like you, what more could you ask?" Scornful laughter rippled through the crowd, but it stilled suddenly when the sound of heavy boots came from the far end of the street. Ethan Ward emerged through the curtain of rain, his tall frame cut dark against the storm, his coat soaked and clinging, his broad shoulders braced like a wall against the wind. Gray-blue eyes burned bright in the dim light as he strode forward and halted in the very center of the circle. His gaze swept the crowd before settling on Naomi, trembling in the mud. For a heartbeat, silence. Then his voice thundered, deep and unyielding. "I will pay her debt." Harlan blinked, his face swelling crimson. "What did you say?" Ethan stepped closer, planting himself squarely before Naomi, his back shielding her from every leering stare. His words came slow and sharp as a blade. "I'll pay every cent Naomi Carter owes. From this day forward, she owes your bank nothing." Lightning split the sky, thunder rolled, and the crowd quaked with the sound. No one dared speak. Then Ethan turned, facing them all. The rain sheeted down, drumming hard against roofs, but his voice carried above it. "You threw mud at her. You tore her shawl. You called her harlot, madwoman, cursed her name. But hear me now. Naomi is mine." The words rang like a verdict. Faces blanched. The women who had jeered shrank back, clutching baskets to their chests. The men who had smirked from the edges lowered their eyes, unable to meet his. Harlan's mouth worked, but no sound came. The smug curl drained from his lips, replaced by purple rage. Yet even he knew the moment had slipped from his grasp. Naomi's tears flowed still, but her breath caught at the sight of Ethan standing before her, broad back braced against the storm, his voice a shield strong enough to silence an entire town. His words struck through the lies, cut through every whisper, and in their place he left her a truth no one could shake. Her heart pounded wildly, tangled with fear and something else, a fragile flame flickering to life in the darkness. Through her blurred vision, a spark of hope glimmered brighter than the lightning overhead. The townsfolk stood rooted, the storm hammering down. And over the roar of the rain came Ethan's voice again, steady as an oath carved in stone. "From this day on, any man or woman who dares dishonor Naomi Carter will reckon with me. And I swear, I will not let it stand." Naomi broke then, but not into despair. Her sobs came ragged, yes, but threaded with release, gratitude, raw humanity. She buried her face in her hands, tears and rain washing together until they were one. Harlan stumbled back, his cane striking the mud, his face twisted with impotent fury. The crowd dispersed, slinking into side streets, no apologies on their lips, only silence. One by one they left until the square was bare save for Naomi in the mud and Ethan standing guard. He bent at last, extending a hand. His palm was broad, warm, unshaken. Naomi placed her trembling hand into his, and he lifted her gently to her feet. "Stand," he said softly, his tone lowered for her alone. "You do not belong to this mud." Naomi rose, legs unsteady, eyes red and swollen. But she looked at him through the veil of rain, and her gaze shifted. It was no longer the look of a woman pleading to be saved, but of one who saw, at last, that there was someone willing to stand for her. The storm still raged, rain lashing hard. Yet in Naomi's heart, the sky was already clearing. That afternoon, Redstone fell under another heavy downpour. The sky had darkened early, clouds piled thick as a weighted blanket over the valley. The first drops struck wooden rooftops like a drum roll. Then the rain unleashed, washing the main street into a blur. Townsfolk rushed for shelter. Vendors yanked canvas over their wares. Horses shrilled in their stalls as thunder cracked. Naomi stepped from Henderson's store, clutching her wicker basket to her chest. Her dress clung wet, but she did not run. She walked steadily toward the road that led to the outskirts. Rain lashed her shoulders like repeated blows, yet she did not flinch. In the past, storms had hidden her tears, let her pain vanish into the torrent. But today her eyes were dry. She no longer carried the posture of a woman bowed by the jeers of a marketplace. Something within her had shifted, ever since one man had stood against the mob for her. Across the street, Ethan Ward emerged, his tall form darkened by the storm. Without hesitation, he cut through the rain, reached for the basket, and gently took it from her arms so her hands were free. Naomi looked up briefly, meeting the familiar gray-blue gaze, and her heart quivered. Neither spoke. They only walked side by side, shoulders brushing, letting the storm fall heavy upon them. The sound of rain roared on tin roofs, wind whipping Redstone's red dust into streaks that vanished into mud. Under awnings, the townsfolk clustered, silent. Eyes followed the pair. The widow once mocked as a scandal, and the weathered man who now walked openly at her side. Those who had jeered days before hushed, cowed by Ethan's mere presence. A few women tugged shawls tighter, whispering, but none dared laugh. The air hung thick, broken only by the drumming storm. Out where the town gave way to fields, the wind pressed harder, driving sheets of water into their clothes. Ethan stopped in the road, his hand resting lightly on Naomi's arm. She turned, startled, and froze when she saw him sink to one knee in the muck. Through the veil of rain, he lifted his face to hers, rough hands clasping hers. His eyes, steady as the mountains, caught hers like iron. "Naomi," his voice rang, deep and clear above the storm. "Marry me. Don't let it be only debt I take from you. Let me walk beside you through every storm that comes." Naomi trembled, tears welling at last. Water streamed down her cheeks, and her sob broke free. "And if one day you leave me too, as my husband did." The words tore out weak and raw, the heart's final defense laid bare. All her years of solitude, the jeers, the funeral with no hands clasped to hers, every shadow rushed back. Fear gripped her harder than rain, fear of being abandoned again, of being proven unworthy of love once more. Ethan rose, drew her against his chest, arms fierce and unshaking. His voice cracked but carried weight as solid as stone. "If that day comes, then at least you will know. You were once loved as you should be." The words struck through her walls, piercing every scar and guarded silence. Naomi sobbed hard, but it was no longer despair. It was the cry of wounds touched, and at last held. She lifted her gaze, eyes glistening, but alight with something brighter than pain. Slowly, trembling, she nodded, and in the torrent they kissed. Their first kiss, not hidden, not stolen, but open in the middle of the red dirt road, beneath the stares of the whole town watching from their shelters. Thunder rolled, but the silence of the people was louder. No one jeered. No one laughed. Faces blanched and uncertain. They could not look away from the truth. Naomi Carter, once spat upon, now stood claimed and cherished. And Ethan Ward towered beside her, declaring love not by whispers, but by the courage to stand against them all. An older woman clutched her daughter's hand, whispering, "That woman, she was chosen." A boy who once whistled at Naomi stared, ashamed. Murmurs rose but faltered, stripped of cruelty. They saw clearly now. The storm was not only rain, but a cleansing. Naomi dropped her basket into the mud and flung her arms around Ethan. Her heart thundered, but for the first time it raced not from dread, but from hope. A fragile hope, yet warm enough to chase the cold from her bones. The rain kept falling, but it no longer caged her. It was a hymn for beginnings. They stood long in the deluge, heedless of soaked clothes and chilled skin. When at last they walked away, their figures side by side, the crowd said nothing. Those who had mocked bowed their heads. Some felt a prickle of shame for the first time in years. Naomi's steps felt light. Her garments hung heavy with water, yet the burden she had borne seemed lifted. Fear remained in her chest, but it was no longer hers alone. It had been shared. Within her a whisper stirred. "If this is a dream, let me never wake." In that downpour, with Ethan kneeling in the mire and the town holding its breath, Naomi Carter ceased to be a shadow. For the first time she was seen, not as gossip, not as ruin, but as a woman chosen. And the man who chose her spoke not with promises spun of air, but with defiance, with arms that would not let her fall. She wept again, but without shame. Her tears mingled with rain, and Ethan's arms steadied her as if to say, "You are no longer alone." Those words, soft as a whisper, rose above the storm and silenced every rumor. The storm that evening swept down on Redstone with a heaviness both fierce and strangely cleansing. Rain drummed against awnings, poured in rivulets along Main Street. And there, in the midst of the white haze, Naomi and Ethan's kiss lingered in the charged silence. From under the market porches, the townsfolk stared, but no jeer, no insult rose to their lips. Only the sound of rain, a curtain of nature itself, muffled every whisper. Then, suddenly, a small boy, the blacksmith's son, broke free from his mother's grip and darted out into the street. He tilted his head back, arms spread wide, and spun round and round in the downpour. His laughter rang out, pure as silver bells. The sight cut clean through the heavy silence. No shame, no judgment, only freedom. Freedom to let the storm touch his skin. Freedom to twirl without fear of watching eyes. Naomi's chest tightened. In that child's spinning form she saw herself in every storm she had endured. Yet now, it no longer looked like madness. It was a reflection, a symbol, liberation. And the whole town, whether they spoke of it or not, had to witness the truth. Her shame had been transformed into freedom. Some women lowered their heads, unable to meet her gaze. Some men stiffened, eyes flickering with doubt. They could not deny it any longer. Naomi Carter had found her place not by anyone's permission, but by the courage to live true. Weeks later, the wedding came. A day of bright sky after long rumor. People gathered, not all in blessing, but none daring mockery. The wooden chapel of Redstone glowed with sunlight, wildflowers drifting their scent inside. Naomi wore a plain dress of cream, no lace, no finery, but her face shone, and her dark eyes held a peace unseen for years. Ethan stood at her side, his coat clean but simple. When his rough hand closed around hers, the chapel hushed. They did not promise with flowery words, but with the gaze of two souls who had seen one another in rain, in disgrace, in weakness stripped bare. When the pastor blessed them, a soft breeze carried the scent of young grass through the open window. Naomi smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. The past, at last, was closed. A year on, Redstone witnessed change. Naomi bore a daughter, dark-haired, bright-eyed. The day she carried the child from the chapel, townsfolk gathered to watch. There were still whispers, but no longer poisoned with scorn. Instead, awkward smiles and softened glances. Ethan lifted the baby high, letting all see. Not as a conqueror, but as a man who had found late joy, big enough to hold even this small town in its embrace. Naomi saw, at the far end of the street, a few widows standing quiet under an eave. Their eyes mixed envy with longing. In that moment she knew her life could not be lived for herself alone. Months later, she and Ethan restored a derelict shed beside their home, turning it into a small meeting place. With rough tables and benches, a hearth burning in winter, it became a refuge for widows. Women carrying losses Redstone had long ignored. They came with their silent eyes. Some had lost husbands to quarry accidents, some to illness, some to abandonment. All carried the same look, the same isolation Naomi once knew. Here, those eyes grew warm again. Naomi sat with them, listening to their stories. She did not promise healing. She only showed them it was possible to live still, to hold one's head high. She told them of the first night she stepped into the rain, of the moment the town nearly crushed her, and of the arms that had steadied her. Their eyes glistened with fragile but real light. Ethan said little, but his quiet labor spoke. Hauling wood, patching roofs, his back bent and his coat muddied again. To the widows, his silence was comfort too, proof that some men did not turn away, did not prey upon weakness, but chose to stand beside it. Time passed, and the little room itself grew into a symbol. Folks called it by different names, but to Naomi it was simply the place where the forsaken found one another. On its wall hung a plain wooden sign, carved with the words, "We still have worth." And whenever storms swept Redstone again, children ran out laughing, faces lifted to the sky, spinning as rain poured. Adults no longer shouted them back inside. Some even smiled. For they had learned from a widow once despised that sometimes, to truly live, one must dare to step into the rain and dance. Each time Naomi stood by the window with her daughter in her arms, watching rain blur the fields, memory returned, but no longer with shame, only with freedom. From the loneliness of a cold cabin, she had found a shoulder strong enough to bear storms with her. Ethan never promised to smooth every path, but he gave her a love true enough, deep enough to mend wounds she thought unhealable. From the moment they joined hands in Redstone's rain, the town itself was changed. None could deny it. Some loves bloom late, yet endure, wild and unbreakable as flowers rising after the storm. Naomi and Ethan's story reminds us it is never too late to be loved and to love in return. Despite years, despite loss, hearts still tremble when they meet the one meant for them. If this story touched your memory or your faith, we invite you to share your thoughts below. We would love to hear from those who have known youth, who have known loss, yet still choose kindness. And don't forget to like and subscribe, so together we keep alive these Wild West love stories, because often it is the simplest tales that walk beside us all our years.